The virgin mail-order bride was terrified, until the rancher's little girl asked, "Can you be Mama?" The train dragged itself across the desert like a wounded beast, wheels shrieking against rusted tracks. Dust clouds rose in its wake, carried by wind that whistled sharp as a knife through sage and sand. Inside the rattling carriage, a young woman sat stiff-backed on a wooden bench, a single scuffed suitcase pressed against her boots. Her hands trembled around a folded envelope, edges worn soft from being read and reread, until the ink itself seemed ready to fade. It was a letter that promised escape, or something close enough to reach for. Written in a hand she did not know, it offered shelter, a roof, a place in a world where she otherwise had none. No photograph, no soft words of romance, only a name, an address, and the blunt suggestion of survival. Her body swayed with the rhythm of the train, though her mind wandered back east, to a town of hunger and whispers, where pity stung sharper than hunger itself. She remembered the looks from men in doorways, the half-spoken rumors, the heavy sense of a life with no horizon. All of it had driven her here, into the desert's wide mouth. The train hissed as it slowed, grinding to a stop. Beside a platform little more than warped planks and a battered sign bleached pale by sun, she stepped down, skirts brushing the dust, heat rising from the ground like breath from a furnace. No one waited with flowers, no smile met her. Only silence, vast and thick as the land itself. Her gaze stretched across the distance, finding the outline of a ranch house crouched against the horizon. Weather-beaten boards leaned with age, fences slumped like broken ribs, and a barn sagged beneath the weight of years. A single horse was tied nearby, its coat dull, mane tangled. Then she saw him. A man stepped from the porch, boots striking wood with slow, deliberate weight. His frame was tall but worn, shoulders bowed not by labor alone, but by something heavier. His eyes, dark cloud eyes, regarded her with caution rather than welcome. A shadow of grief hung about him, clinging the way smoke lingers long after fire dies. "You're here," he said, voice low, rough, as though every word scraped across stone. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. The desert wind filled the space instead, carrying with it the smell of dust and dry grass. He nodded once, curt, then lifted her suitcase from her hand, as if it weighed no more than a feather. The air between them was heavy, not hostile, not warm, merely heavy, as though both stood inside a house of ghosts. It was then she noticed movement at the doorway. A small figure lingered there, half hidden by the frame. A child. A girl no older than 6 or 7, hair tangled, cheeks smudged with the faint gray of dust. She clutched a ragged doll with one arm tight against her chest, her wide eyes fastened on the stranger who had stepped into their silence. "Yo." Woman's heart jolted, not from fear, from recognition. The recognition of loneliness mirrored back at her, raw and unguarded. The girl did not speak. She only stared, lips pressed thin, eyes dark pools that seemed to ask questions no adult. Dared voice, behind her, the rancher's jaw tightened. His hand rested against the post as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. For a flicker of a moment, his gaze softened on the child. Then the storm returned, sealing him off once more. "Come inside," he said at last. The words were not invitation, but necessity, spoken like a man who had no choice but to share his roof. She followed him up the creaking steps, boots heavy with dust, suitcase swinging at his side. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and smoke, of meals cooked long ago and rooms too long closed. Shadows clung to corners and silence pressed down as firm as a hand on her chest. The girl had vanished deeper into the house, leaving only the faint sound of her small feet on wooden floors. The woman stood in the entryway, clutching her shawl close. The letter was still in her pocket, crumpled now, useless now. Survival had brought her here, but standing in the dim hush of the widower's home, she felt something shift. Not relief, not yet. Only the sharp edge of fate, sliding unseen beneath her skin. Outside, wind swept across the plains, rattling dry grass, whistling through gaps in the fence. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, its shadow gliding over cracked earth. And in the doorway of her mind, she still saw the girl's eyes, wide, lonely, waiting. The first nights were brittle with silence. The house, though built of solid timber, felt hollow, every creak of its boards carrying like a groan through the dark. The wind swept across the plains and rattled the shutters, while coyotes called to each other in long, mournful howls. In the hush between those sounds came the faint cough of a child, small, sharp, echoing through thin walls. The woman lay awake, on the narrow bed that had been made for her, staring at the ceiling where moonlight cut through cracks in the boards. She felt less a wife than a trespasser, an intruder wandering through a house that still belonged to someone else. The presence of the rancher's late wife lingered everywhere. In the trunk at the foot of the bed, folded carefully beneath lavender, sachets, lay dresses that had not known daylight in years. On a kitchen shelf, a row of recipe cards in looping feminine handwriting waited, untouched, as though the woman who had written them might return at any moment. The air itself seemed thick with absence, dust settling in corners like grief that refused to move on. By day, she shielded herself with work. Her hands found purpose in torn shirts needing mending, in gathering eggs from restless hens, in sweeping grit from the floorboards, though it always found its way back again. She hummed hymns half forgotten from childhood, the notes thin, almost swallowed by the vast silence of the rooms. The little girl watched her, quiet, careful, like a creature half wild, unaccustomed to strangers. She followed at a distance at first, peeking from doorways, hiding behind posts, her ragged doll always clutched close. Yet with each day, her distance shrank. She began to trail the woman as she moved from chore to chore, her footsteps soft, her eyes wide with something between curiosity and longing. The rancher spoke little. His words came like the land itself, sparse, dry, practical. He asked if the eggs were gathered, if the fence held, if the feed was measured. When their eyes met, it was never for long. In him, she sensed a man who carried a wound too deep to show and too heavy to set down. One evening, the sun melting into crimson across the plains, she sat by the hearth with the little girl before her. The child's hair was tangled into stubborn knots, a wild mess from days of wind and play. Patiently, the woman drew a comb through it, careful not to pull too hard, her hands gentle though her heart trembled. The fire snapped softly. Outside, the coyotes called again. The girl shifted, doll resting in her lap. Then, in a voice no louder than the crack of kindling, she whispered, "Can you be Mama?" The comb stilled in the woman's hand. Her breath caught as though struck. The words, simple as they were, landed harder than any bullet. Her fingers shook against the strands of hair. Tears threatened, but did not fall. She searched for something to say, some kindness, some truth. But no words came. From the shadow of the doorway, a figure stood. The rancher. He had come unnoticed, his broad frame filling the doorframe, his face unreadable in the dim glow of firelight. Yet his jaw tightened, muscles clenching as though a blade had been thrust into him. His hand curled at his side. His eyes lingered on the woman, then dropped to his daughter, then closed for a fleeting second, as if the pain there was too much to bear. The silence thickened. The woman dared not move, dared not speak, caught between the child's yearning and the father's grief. The girl, unaware of the storm she had stirred, leaned back against the woman's knee, her trust laid bare in that simple question. The rancher stepped away before a word passed his lips, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he vanished back, into the deeper dark of the house. The woman sat frozen, comb still tangled in the girl's hair, her pulse racing. She was no longer merely a bride brought west by a letter and a name. That moment marked a fracture in the walls around them. The child's longing had reached into the marrow of her fear, cracking it open. She felt the weight of choice pressing upon her chest, not of paper, not of contract, but a heart she had locked away, now tugged toward a bond she had not expected, and a man who fought against an ache he had sworn he would never feel again. The fire burned low. Outside, the desert night deepened. Inside, three souls sat bound together by silence, grief, and the faintest, most dangerous spark of hope. The town was small, but its whispers carried farther than the desert wind. By the time the woman stepped into the general store, those whispers had already reached every corner, coiled around every porch post and spittoon. Bought bride, they called her, though not always to her face. Sometimes in chuckles when her back was turned, sometimes in sidelong glances sharp enough to cut. She walked the narrow aisle, the boards beneath her boots groaning. Jars of beans and flour sacks lined the shelves. Yet it was not goods she gathered. In her hands, it was stares. A woman behind the counter smirked into her apron. A man near the barrels spat tobacco juice too close to her feet. Others looked at her with pity, their eyes dropping quick, as if ashamed of their own thoughts. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her chin level. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though shame itself clung to her skirts. When the clerk asked if she had coin, her voice barely carried. The exchange finished. She slipped from the store into the sunlight, her breath shaking, her basket trembling in her grip. That night, the weight of it followed her. She stepped outside barefoot, the porch rough beneath her soles. Dust cooled under her feet as she walked out into the open yard. The horizon stretched before her, endless and merciless. Above, stars drowned slowly in the heavy black of a sky that seemed intent on swallowing even the smallest flicker of light. She hugged herself against the chill, not of weather, but of solitude. That was when she heard the crunch of boots behind her. The rancher stood there, hat in his hands, his face shadowed, but his eyes unguarded in the starlight. For the first time, his voice came softer than the desert wind. "I never meant for this," he said. The words were simple, but they carried. Like confession, she turned, breath catching. "Then why?" His jaw tightened. He looked toward the barn as though he might find courage in its silhouette. "The letter wasn't mine. My brother wrote it. He thought a woman might keep this place alive. Might keep her alive." His voice broke faintly on the last word, meaning the child. The truth struck harder than the whispers. Betrayal and understanding tangled inside her chest. She felt used, lied to. Yet she also saw him, saw the weight on his shoulders, heavy as the desert sky pressing down on every living thing beneath it. Before she could speak, the wind shifted. A low growl rolled over the land. Clouds gathered, swallowing the stars, until only lightning's jagged flash lit the earth. The storm came fast. Windows rattled, wind slammed against the walls, and rain fell in sheets sharp as stones. The barn groaned, its roof thrashing under the assault. Together they ran into the chaos. The woman's skirt clung heavy with rain, mud sucking at her steps. Inside the barn, horses screamed, stamping against their stalls. The rancher fought to secure the doors, his muscles straining against the surge of wind. She darted toward the lantern, shielding its flame with her body, guiding trembling animals. To safety, thunder cracked overhead. A board tore loose, crashing to the ground with a scream of nails. Lightning flared, painting his face in white fire as he wrestled a beam back into place. She reached to steady it with him, her hands slick with rain and mud. For one breathless moment, their hands met, pressed together against the wood, fingers trembling, palms burning with more than effort. They looked at each other through the storm's fury, silent yet alive in a way neither had felt in years. The roof held, the wind screamed, the rain poured, but together they braced it. Together they endured. When at last the storm began to pass, they stood there in the mud, soaked through, lantern light flickering against their faces. Their breaths came hard, their eyes locked. Nothing was spoken. Nothing needed to be. Something had stirred in the darkness, fragile, trembling, but undeniable. Morning came, but with it, no peace. The storm had passed in the night, leaving puddles glinting in the dawn, earth torn soft by rain. The ranch house stood weary, but unbroken, boards damp and dark. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the faint smell of coffee, yet the silence was uneasy. It was the kind of stillness that waits for trouble. She felt it first, the prickle at the back of her neck as she carried a pail from the well. The sound of hooves broke the morning calm, slow at first, then purposeful. She turned, water sloshing, to see two riders crest the ridge. They came not like neighbors, but like carrion birds circling meat. Dust lifted around them as they reined in at the gate, their horses restless beneath them. One was thin, fox-faced, with a grin too sharp to be friendly. The other carried bulk in his shoulders and a revolver on his hip, fingers drumming its handle like a habit. "Morning," the fox-faced one called, lifting a folded paper in one hand. His voice carried the oily drawl of a man who already believed he owned what he asked for. Business to discuss. The rancher stepped onto the porch, unhurried, his frame casting long shadow in the sun. His face showed no surprise. Perhaps he had been expecting them. The riders leaned forward in their saddles, flashing the paper and the steel at their sides. "Debt owed," the grinner said, "and land to settle it. Simple enough." The rancher's voice came low, steady as stone. "This land's paid with blood and bone." "Not for sale," the bigger man spat into the dirt. "Widowers make poor landholders. Ain't hard for property to slip into better hands." His hand lingered near the revolver, just enough to remind them all it was there. The woman froze where she stood, every muscle tight. Yet she watched him, this man who had carried grief like a chain for years, standing unyielding before vultures who circled for scraps. His spine did not bend, his voice did not falter. He was more than sorrow. He was strength, though worn. And raw. Still, she saw the truth beneath it. Alone, he could not guard both the ranch and the child at once. His weight was too heavy, his arms too few. The riders laughed, their eyes sliding toward her. "That the wife?" the fox-faced one sneered. "Bought, was she? Cheaper than keeping stock, I reckon." Heat rushed into her chest. Shame first, then anger. She felt the girl's small hand clutch her skirt, hiding against her leg, trembling. Something hardened inside her. Stronger than fear, she stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, startled even herself. Clear, steady, sharp as a whip. "This is no place for jackals. Ride. On." The laughter stopped. The riders stared at her, surprise flickering into something darker. "Well now," the big one muttered. "The little bride has a tongue." She did not falter. "You'll take your paper and your lies elsewhere. This land isn't yours. It never will be." The silence that followed was tight as a drawn bow. The girl clung to her harder, whispering in a voice that broke like dry twigs. "Don't leave." The woman looked down at her, saw the wide eyes wet with fear, the doll crushed to her chest. And in that moment, everything shifted. She understood. She was no longer a stranger passing through a house of ghosts. The land, the child, even the broken man whose jaw clenched beside her, they had become hers too. The fox-faced rider gave a thin smile, but his eyes glinted hard. "We'll be back," he said, "and when we come, it won't be for talk." They wheeled their horses, dust rising like smoke, hooves pounding as they disappeared over the ridge. The air settled heavy in their absence. She felt her knees weaken, her breath shudder, but she did not let go of the child's hand. The rancher stepped to her side, his face unreadable, though his eyes, storm-dark, fierce, met hers for a moment longer than before. "Side," he said at last, though softer than he ever had before. And together with the child between them, they walked back through the gate, not as strangers, not yet as family, but bound now by something no paper, no bullet, could easily break. The night split open with fire. It began as a glow on the horizon, faint at first, like dawn arriving too soon. But dawn did not roar. Dawn did not scream. By the time the woman stirred from her bed, the smell of smoke already seeped through the walls, sharp, acrid, choking. She rushed to the window, heart slamming. Flames licked the edges of the barn, bright tongues twisting toward the sky. The rancher was already outside, boots pounding the earth, shouting for water, for buckets, for anything. His voice was hoarse against the crackle, against the furious scream of burning wood. Horses thrashed inside, their terrified cries splitting the night. The little girl woke screaming, clutching her doll, eyes wild with terror. The woman gathered, her in trembling arms, rushing toward the door as sparks rained down like falling stars. Smoke clawed her lungs, heat seared her skin. She stumbled into the yard, where the world had turned to chaos. The barn's roof sagged under the blaze. Boards snapped, falling with the sound of bones breaking. The rancher fought against the doors, straining to free the trapped animals, his face lit in violent flickers of orange and gold. Shadows of men rode just beyond the light, dark silhouettes against the horizon. The land grabbers. They had returned, and with them the fire. "Stay back," the rancher shouted to her, his voice raw. But she could not stand still, not while the child whimpered against her chest, not while flames consumed everything around them. She dragged the girl toward the well, shielding her from falling embers. Her dress caught at the hem, smoldering. She slapped at it, the heat blistering her skin. Her lungs burned with smoke, every breath a knife. Yet she pressed on, desperate, alive. The rancher wrestled the barn door open, horses bursting into the night, eyes rolling white, manes aflame with sparks. He staggered, coughing, his body bent beneath the weight of smoke. But he did not yield. He beat at flames with his jacket, driving the animals clear, refusing to let them die in the fire. The woman pulled the child into the dirt, covering her with her own body as sparks rained down. The girl's sobs shook through her, each sound a plea, each breath a prayer. The night stretched endless, marked only by fire's roar and the crash of collapsing beams. And then, silence. The barn gave one last groan before falling in on itself, sparks scattering like stars, leaving nothing but ash and smoke. Dawn came slow. The land was gray with it, heavy, tired. The barn was nothing more than a blackened skeleton, smoke curling from its bones. Horses stood huddled near the fence, trembling, but alive. The girl clung to her mother's skirts, hers, truly now, as though letting go meant death. The woman's dress was scorched, her arms raw with burns. She sat in the dirt, coughing, her hair tangled with soot. The rancher knelt beside her, hands trembling as he gathered cloth and water. He bound her burns with care, though his own arms shook, his breath ragged. "You could have died," he rasped. She looked at him, lips cracked, eyes bright with exhaustion. "So could you." His hands froze against her skin. His face was ash-streaked. Eyes red, but it was not the smoke that made them glisten. His voice cracked open like a man whose strength had finally run dry. "I swore I couldn't love again," he said. The words tore out of him, jagged, raw, unpolished. "I swore the ground took it all when it took her. But I was wrong. Silence after was heavier than fire, heavier than loss. Her throat tightened. She had carried her own truth like a stone in her chest, silent, unspoken. Now it broke free. "I didn't come here for love," she whispered. "I came west to survive, to escape hunger, shame. I thought I was selling myself for a roof, nothing more." Her hand trembled against his, scorched skin pressing into his rough palm. "But here," her voice faltered, then steadied. "Here I found something I didn't believe I'd ever deserve." His eyes searched hers, storm and grief and hope all colliding. Neither moved at first, both trembling, both broken open. Then slowly, as if afraid the moment might shatter, he leaned closer. Their lips met, not with passion's blaze, but with the hesitant surrender of two souls too long starved. It was not fire but rain, falling soft, falling necessary, falling on cracked earth aching for relief. The girl stirred beside them, her small hand slipping into the woman's, holding tight. The man's other hand closed over them both, rough and scarred, yet gentle as the dawn. The barn was gone. The land was scarred. But the family, what they had begun to build, remained, scarred yet unbroken. And in the ruins, in the ash, something new had taken root. Morning rose quiet after the fire, a pale light spilling across blackened beams, and fields still damp with ash. The ranch bore its scars like a wounded animal, fences bent, earth scorched, walls charred with smoke. Yet it still stood, and so did they. In the days that followed, neighbors came. Wagons rolled across the prairie with tools and timber, men carrying hammers, women bearing bread, children darting underfoot. They had watched from afar when the fire lit the sky. Now they arrived with calloused hands and steady eyes, where silence once ruled. Hammers rang. Sawdust filled the air, mixing with smoke's fading scent. Plank by plank, the barn rose again. Boards were nailed firm, beams set straight, fences lifted from ruin. The rancher worked among them, shoulders squared, scars on his arms bared in the sun. He did not ask for pity, nor did he receive it. What he received was respect. The bride worked too. Her burned arms still ached, but she stitched and mended, cooked for tired workers, sang soft hymns while brushing dirt from a child's hair. The girl ran barefoot through half-built fences, laughter ringing where once only wind howled. That sound became the heartbeat of the place, pulling even the most hardened men to pause, smile, remember. The townsfolk who had once smirked and whispered in store aisles now looked at her differently. She was no longer the bought bride dragged westward by contract. She was the woman who faced men with rifles, who carried a child through fire, who stitched ruin back into hope. Their gazes softened, shame replacing mockery. Some nodded in greeting. Others lingered longer, hats pressed to their chests in quiet acknowledgement. Still, nights carried shadows. The rancher often stood alone beneath the sky, the weight of memory, heavy as ever. The fire had taken more than wood. It had torn open the grave of his grief. Yet as he leaned on the post outside the new barn, watching the woman move in lamplight, watching his daughter trail her skirts like a tether, he felt something shift. The ache remained, but it no longer bled. It had become a scar, healing in the presence of those who chose to stay. One evening, as the horizon bled gold into crimson, the girl tugged at her new mother's hand. Dust swirled low across the yard, catching fire in the dying sun. The woman bent to brush hay from the child's hair, soot still marking faint shadows across her own face. "You stayed," the little girl whispered, her voice fragile, reverent, as though the words themselves might vanish if spoken too loud. The woman froze, breath catching. Then she knelt, eyes brimming. Tears traced clean lines down her ash-stained cheeks. She pulled the girl close, whispering into her hair, "I'll always stay." The child buried her face against her, arms tight around her neck, the ragged doll pressed between them. In that embrace, the woman felt the vow sealed deeper than any letter, deeper than any promise inked on paper. This was not survival. This was belonging. The rancher watched from the shadows of the porch. The sun's last light drew a halo over them. Woman and child bound not by blood but by choice, by fire endured, by love too stubborn to be burned away. He leaned heavier on the post, his breath unsteady. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man standing beside a grave. He felt like a man watching life begin again. Wind swept across the land, carrying dust in long ribbons that shimmered in the fading light. Once, that wind had sounded like curse, whispering of loss, of loneliness. Tonight, it carried the weight of blessing. It sang over fences mended, over hands joined, over hearts learning to heal. The barn stood rebuilt, the fences stretched straight. The hearth glowed with fire not born of ruin but of warmth. The ranch was not what it had been before. No place ever could be after such scars, but it had become something new, a home built of dust and dawn, not by contract, not by blood, but by fire, endurance, and the fragile, eternal vow of staying.